The metal veins of Zarthan Station groaned under the strain of time and silence. Once a jewel of interstellar engineering, it now stood as a half-lit carcass, drifting in the outer fringe. Post-war neglect had left its compartments riddled with half-functioning systems and rusted promises. Kale Varel, field engineer and decorated survivor of the Arc Rift conflict, paced the echoing corridors with a scanner in one hand and a layer of soot on the other. His boots thudded softly against dust-cloaked plating, the rhythmic tap, the only trace of human presence for hundreds of kilometers. He had spent 3 full cycles tracking the phantom bleed of Nithron fuel, an elusive green-glowing substance more volatile than plasma and 10 times as rare. The station's diagnostics were useless. Every pressure line read clean. No visible drips, no scorched insulation, no burnt residues. And yet, the power levels dropped. The energy grid choked like something was siphoning it alive. KL's fingers twitched over the scan pad, rerouting its pulse into the lower maintenance shaft's territory off limits, even during peak operations. His breath fogged against the cooler air as he descended a narrow spiral of lightless stairs, ducking under corroded beam struts and past maintenance drones frozen mid-task. A static pulse whispered across his visor, the signal of Nithron faint but real. The leak wasn't mechanical. Threading between coolant regulators and anti-rad tubing, he rounded a final column and froze. Emergency lights flickered in copper intervals, casting shadows that danced like ghosts along the piping. Against the glow, nestled in an alcove framed by melted insulation and humming circuits, was a figure. She stood almost unnaturally still, the green of her skin radiating with a soft shimmer that mirrored the hue of the missing fuel. Silvery white hair fell across her shoulders in luminous threads. One hand cupped a repurposed canister, and with each gentle tilt, Kael watched the unmistakable swirl of Nithron fuel stream into her throat. Salira. The station's leak had a pulse. She bore the markings of the Lunari, a race thought extinct, or at best, scattered, hunted across systems for their ability to metabolize high-energy materials. Nithron to humans was containment-class hazard. To her it seemed essential. In that still moment, something more than curiosity tethered the air. Her eyes pupilless and violet glowed faintly, tracking him with a calm absence of fear. It was not an act of defiance or seduction. It was survival performed in solitude until interrupted by a human with calloused hands and grease under his nails. Kael moved forward, not out of aggression, but an instinct honed in collapsed outposts and scorched refugee hubs. The kind that reached for the injured before the armed. The kind that had once led him into crossfire to pull out a child with 6 lungs and a dying translator chip. He crouched, studying the readings again. The air density around her pulsed faintly with energy, the same resonance as the drained grid above. The realization came with weight. She wasn't just drinking the station's power. Her biology harmonized with it. She had become part of the system's entropy. And yet the signs of exhaustion were everywhere. Tightness around her limbs, the diminished glow of her skin, the slight tremor in her fingers as she lowered the canister. This was not indulgence. It was desperation, wrapped in grace. Kael knew the protocols. Report anomalous life form, isolate, secure, extract. But standing before him was not a life form. It was a person. Slender, shimmering, foreign, but unmistakably sentient, breathing the same thinning air, trembling in the same cold. He did not reach for a weapon. Instead, he pulled off his heat-lined vest and laid it gently on a nearby rail. The station's chill bit deeper in his absence, but he did not flinch. The only thing he reached for was the scan pad's manual override. The tracking logs would not show what he saw here. It was not heroism. It was not rebellion. It was instinct, and something softer than either, something he had almost forgotten in the long years of mechanical tasks and battle scars. Compassion. As the Nithron-powered systems above flickered back to partial strength, he stood blocking the emergency light so her glow could remain undisturbed. The war had taken many things from him, comrade's certainty home. But it had not taken this. And so in the broken belly of a forgotten station, under the soft pulse of fading fuel and flickering sensors, Kael Varel met Salira not with commands, but with quiet presence. The upper levels of Zarthan Station creaked as emergency protocols spun through half-awake routines. Somewhere above Commander Vale would be scanning fluctuating readouts, barking orders to increasingly confused systems analysts, unaware that his station's salvation and greatest breach rested in Kael Varel's arms. Salira had accepted the vest without protest, her fingers brushing his briefly in the transfer. There had been no spoken thanks, only a soft hum in the air like Nitheron flowing through cooled pipes. It wasn't submission. It wasn't trust. It was acknowledgement, a shared understanding that no alarm would be raised, not yet. Kael moved ahead first, mapping their escape route through disused maintenance corridors. Salira followed close, her steps nearly silent despite the bulk of a repurposed utility jacket hanging loosely from her shoulders. In each corridor, the lighting barely held. Kael's helmet lamp provided the only clarity, casting golden rays over utility labels faded with age. Whenever they passed under a surveillance node, he moved instinctively to shield her body with his own. Their pace was deliberate. A sudden movement might trigger automated monitors. The heat signatures would be suspicious enough even before the biological anomaly that was her entire form entered the equation. Each checkpoint they passed felt like a heartbeat too long. A flickering sensor, a stuttering airlock, a clanking echo from a nearby shaft. Every sound demanded Kael's full alertness, and still he checked behind him constantly, not for pursuit, but to make sure she was still there. He began to notice small things. The way her skin dulled when they neared depleted conduits and brightened near active current. How she tilted her head at junction panels, almost listening, like tuning to frequencies beneath human hearing. Once, when his foot slipped on a patch of frozen condensation, her hand shot out and steadied him before he could fall. The contact left a residual warmth unexpected in someone who metabolized energy rather than produced it. They reached his quarters without incident. Sparse and functional, the room carried the scent of solder metal polish and a stubborn potted plant that refused to die. A schematic of the station's old reactor core was pinned to the wall beside a half-disassembled servo unit. A single bed occupied the back corner opposite a tiny galley space with cold rations and a weak kettle. Kael locked the door and reset the privacy field. Only then did Salira sit carefully perching on the edge of his work table. Her luminous hair cascaded over the dusty blueprints, a stark contrast of alien beauty in a place built for utility. The silence lingered not out of awkwardness but preservation. Words might break the delicate balance they had somehow established. Kael turned to the ration unit and retrieved a thermopack of nutrient paste. It wasn't gourmet, but it was warmth. He placed it on the table near her, unsure if she could even consume human food. She didn't reach for it, but neither did she recoil. The Nitheron was what her body needed. Everything else was at best symbolic. Sleep did not come easily. He offered the bed, choosing instead to rest beside the door with a blanket wrapped tight. Despite the steel floor beneath him, the soft hum of the energy grid slowly stabilizing thanks to her abstention lulled him into a half-doze. It was in that strange twilight of awareness, half dream, half calculation, that the weight of his choice began to settle. He had just smuggled a high-risk alien anomaly into his quarters. He had concealed evidence from command, and if discovered, he would be stripped of rank, imprisoned, or worse. But still, he had not hesitated. The next rotation brought complications. The station's energy flow began leveling out, and with that came questions. Commander Vale issued search orders to sweep every maintenance shaft. Kael volunteered to lead one of the teams, buying time and misdirecting scans. Salira, hidden in a repurposed cargo hold fitted with a siphoned feed of low-grade Nitheron, maintained minimal intake. In the dead spaces between obligations, Kael returned to her. Each time the interactions grew subtly different. A nod turned into a glance. A brush of fingers exchanging a tool turned into a deliberate hand resting just a moment longer. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was understanding. During one of the long power recalibration shifts, he found her curled near a ventilation panel, her glow faint and her breath shallow. Without thought, he scooped her into his arms and carried her back to the heat of his room. Her body pulsed gently against his chest, the energy flowing like a quiet current. For the first time, she allowed herself to rest, with her head near his heartbeat, absorbing something more than Nitheron, perhaps presence, perhaps comfort. Kael adjusted his routines. She adjusted her form, sometimes shrouding her glow behind layered cloth, other times remaining motionless for hours, conserving her charge. Neither of them needed to say what they both knew. The longer she stayed, the less likely it became she would ever leave. She had found a human who didn't see her as a liability. He had found an anomaly who made the silence bearable. Their rhythm grew steady. So steady, in fact, that Kyle almost missed the ping from his personal diagnostics. A dormant module deep within the storage deck had begun emitting ancient Lunari code. It was not the station that had malfunctioned. It was the station that had awakened. Kyle rerouted the ping manually, isolating its frequency and encrypting the feedback channel before the station's central systems could register it. The pulse was unmistakably Lunari, an old resonance pattern encoded not in logic but in harmonic signatures. Frequencies layered in biological wavelengths meant to be interpreted not by machines but by living tissue. There was no accidental trigger. Something had called to Celira. With her reserves running dangerously low and his deception nearing exposure, Kyle made the decision in less time than it took to cycle a power gate. He transferred her under cover of a thermal blackout, leading her through subdecks that had been sealed since the first orbital siege 2 decades earlier. Each step brought them closer to the core, the original life support bay, from when Zarthan Station had been a medical hub during the early colonization period. They found the pod nestled in a sealed vault. Ancient of Lunari origin, yet somehow integrated with human interface systems. A stasis unit shaped more like a cocoon than a capsule rested in the chamber's center, surrounded by decayed medical equipment and vines of auxiliary cabling. The hum it emitted resonated with the Nitheron fuel lines, drawing pulses into its matrix, like breath into lungs. Kale ran a cursory scan. Readings pulsed across the display: bioadaptive systems, nanofusion injection, neuroimmersion thresholds. The pod had capabilities far beyond what even military-grade medbays offered. It did not just heal, it rewrote. Celira approached her glow, already syncing with the chamber's rhythm. The harmonics intensified, forming a lattice of resonance between her and the cocoon. Her body trembled. The feedback loop had begun, but she lacked the strength to complete it. Without conscious thought, Kale stripped off his outer armor and climbed into the chamber beside her. The pod shifted sensors, recalibrating for a dual imprint. The last thing he saw before the world dissolved into bioluminescent code was her face inches from his and the radiant flare of violet in her eyes as their bodies touched. The immersion was total. Inside the pod, time disintegrated. Physical form softened into molecular presence. He felt her thoughts not as words, but as echoes, fractured memories of planetary skies, childhood pain and starlight feasts. She felt his in return, shrapnel scars, the quiet grief of loss, the cold steel of duty. Their emotions spiraled, tangled, pulsed. The chamber did not merely heal, it harmonized. Through biochemical induction and genetic alignment, the pod created a fusion, a shared interface built from resonance fields, nerve signatures, and memory scaffolding. Their DNA refracted through one another, adjusting nucleotide sequences in real time. What began as a medical protocol became an evolutionary junction. Then came the second pulse. A new rhythm entered the chamber, soft, rapid, nascent. A third signature, fragile yet distinct, where Kale's presence was heat and grounding, and Celira's was luminescence and flow. This new presence sparked with electric curiosity and quiet awe. The chamber responded. Nutritional lines rerouted. Hormonal thresholds spiked. Cellular walls thickened. Neurochemical alerts blinked in organic patterns. They were no longer two. The Lunari pod had not only fused their bodies, but initiated something deeper: biological generation through resonance stability. What had been an energy link became a biological bond. What had been survival became inception. When Kyle's eyes opened again, they were still inside the pod, now cooled and inert. The cocoon had fulfilled its task. Celira lay beside him, her body recharged, skin glowing with a brighter hue than before. Her hand rested against his chest, emitted a warmth that wasn't heat but frequency. Between them, nestled within the shared pulse that now tethered their nervous systems, the new life fluttered faintly, not visible yet, but felt. Constantly. Kyle sat up slowly, expecting disorientation or pain, but instead found clarity. He no longer needed his scanner. He could sense the energy flows through the station, perceive weak sectors, hear the hum of Nitheron lines faltering behind layered walls. Celira stirred her breath, releasing a cascade of harmonic tones he now instinctively understood. They had become a biological node, a pair of sentient processors linked not only by emotion, but by genome and circuitry. What she once did by instinct, he now supported with precision. And what he once did with calculation, she now augmented through intuition. Their bond was complete. The station around them, still unaware of the transformation below its steel skin, continued its slow drift through space. But now, deep in its core, two heartbeats resonated in sync, and a third whispered between them, woven in frequencies no sensor could measure. Their child had already begun to dream. In the aftermath of the fusion, the world did not resume as it had been. It became something else, something fluid seen through layered sight and heard in frequencies that no human ears had ever parsed. Kyle Varel moved through the station's arteries with the effortless precision of someone who had become part of its architecture. Every shift in Nitheron pressure, every flicker in the conduits registered as sensation along his spine. His hands could now interface with control panels before conscious thought. He was no longer just the mechanic. He was the station's pulse. Beside him, Celira strode with grace sharpened by renewal. Her glow had deepened into hues that pulsed in time with his own rhythms. Where once she had moved cautiously, now her presence resonated with kinetic authority. Where he calculated, she felt. Where she reached, he extended. Together, they were more than complementary. They were symmetrical. The bond between them amplified reflexes, merged instincts, layered perceptions. Their connection became an unspoken language. Movements preempted danger sensed before it manifested. In battle, they were not two entities fighting side by side. They were a single system wielding dual forms. When the first boarding skirmish hit Zarthan Station, it came like static over comms, unexpected, jagged, and violent. It began in the outer hull as the Collector's scout ships attempted to force airlock access with magnetic torches and neural disruptors. The sensors Kale once trusted now warned him through bone-deep instinct. He didn't wait for orders from Commander Vale. He moved. Celira followed unarmed but fully charged. As they neared the breach point, the hallway lights shattered in a cascading burst, followed by the dull thump of pressurized armor boots touching steel. The Collectors were not subtle. Kale routed the lights to flicker in strobing patterns, overwhelming the enemy's optic implants. The shadows danced like blades. In that chaos, he and Celira surged forward. His plasma wrench struck first, shattering a helmet into sparks. Her palm followed not as a blow, but as a pulse of directed energy ripping into the next attacker with a burst of harmonic vibration that liquefied the sensory gel within their gear. They fought as one. Where Kyle ducked, she rolled. Where she swept, he covered. The bond allowed them to fight with choreographed precision like dancers whose only music was danger. Celira's energy arcs burst in calculated bursts, never too strong, never misaligned her body, regulating output through Kale's awareness of their shared limits. When a Collector tossed a phase charge into their path, Kale reacted a heartbeat before it detonated. He reached, caught Celira by the waist, twisted, and threw them both behind a reinforced beam, just as the blast roared through the corridor. Sparks kissed his exposed neck, but her hand on his back sent a jolt of restorative current through his nervous system. Pain nullified mid-surge. In the fight's stillness, Kale activated a hybrid tool he'd improvised hours earlier, a transmitter blade built from scavenged Collector parts and human alloy. Now tuned through their bond, it resonated in low-phase frequency, matching Celira's pulse. When he drove it into the bulkhead near the next breach, it unleashed a disruptive harmonic wave that bent enemy comms into gibberish. Celira amplified it, her fingertips flaring with controlled voltage that surged through the grid-flooding Collector suits with false signals turning targeting systems against their wielders. The invaders panicked, fired on shadows, stumbled over one another in malfunctioning armor. This was not just defense, it was dominance. For the first time in recorded human-Collector encounters, a mixed unit, a human-Lunari pair, outmaneuvered and dismantled a full tactical boarding party with no backup, no oversight, and no formal weaponry. Just resonance. Just fusion. Kale left the last one conscious barely to crawl back toward the airlock. His helmet flickered with static optics, bleeding sparks, but his signal was clear. The Collectors now knew. The Vidian they tracked was no longer alone. She had merged with a human, and together they were something their algorithms could not quantify. In the aftermath, Celira stood with her bare feet on cracked plating, Nitheron energy pulsing around her calves like fog. Her chest rose and fell in tandem with Kale's. Beneath her skin, their child stirred, reacting to adrenaline not with fear, but with awakening. The fight had not drained her. It had fed her. It had fed them all. The fusion wasn't just spiritual or emotional. It was tactical. It was evolutionary. And it was unstoppable. The collectors did not retreat. They regrouped. Captain Zarn's vessel, a sleek predator with crimson etching along its hull, and a pulse engine that bled radiation into every quadrant it passed through, hovered like a carrion god above Zarthan Station. Within its core, algorithms built on centuries of harvested data pulsed with urgency. Vidian energy had always been detectable, predictable. What registered now, however, defied the models. Two sources intertwined. One human, one Lunari. Resonance signatures folded through one another in recursive loops. Energy output exceeding biological limits, not parasitic consumption. Symbiotic synthesis. Captain Zarn made his decision. Retrieval protocols initiated. 2 boarding craft launched armed with neuro-anchors and energy suppressors capable of disabling a starship engine in mid-jump. Zarthan Station lit up with warning pulses, every deck screaming threat levels in unison. Inside the operations hub, Kale and Celira stood before the tactical display, their bonded pulses visible not just in biometric logs, but in the fluctuating harmony of the station itself. Where once the grid had groaned and flickered under strain, it now purred, its efficiency sharpened by their proximity. Commander Vale, always rigid with protocol, could only pace and demand containment. But containment was already lost. This wasn't a standard anomaly anymore. This was transformation. Celira traced a glowing hand over the station schematic. Her awareness now merged with the platform's harmonic grid. The collectors would reach the upper decks in 4 minutes. Their tools would bypass shielding. And once aboard, they would not negotiate. They would extract, dissect, and upload. Kale offered the plan first. An energy burst. A pulse forged from the newly stabilized Nitheron flows, amplified by Celira's presence. Not a weapon traditionally defined, but a harmonic disruption engineered specifically to overload collector tech. They would need to reroute auxiliary conduits, collapse secondary redundancies, and prime the emitter array. Originally a communications beacon into a focused lance of synthetic resonance. Celira could not do it alone. Her energy would shape the signature, but Kale's modifications, born of human improvisation, would give it form. Precision met intuition, machine met symphony. As the station trembled under the first waves of magnetic grapples from the boarding shuttles, they descended together toward the emitter chamber. The pulse of unborn life stirred within Celira with increased rhythm. It wasn't fear. It was resonance, mimicking its creators, adapting even now. The emitter array had never been meant for this. Designed to send low-band pings and long-distance status bursts, it now throbbed with unstable potential. Kyle worked, fast fingers moving with a rhythm that mirrored Celira's own pulses. Every wire he crossed, every core he realigned became a shared act, an extension of their unity. Above them, airlocks groaned. Collectors swarmed into corridors, their boots slamming against metal with inhuman coordination. They spoke through static and moved like shadows, but their precision couldn't pierce the uncertainty of what waited below. Kale and Celira stood before the now primed array. Energy pulsed between their bodies, forming visible arcs of light. The room itself seemed to bend inward toward them walls, humming with frequencies too deep for any singular species to perceive. Together, they laid their hands on the core node. Celira's breath slowed. Kale's heart synced with hers. Then release. The pulse tore through the station like a silent scream. No sound, but everywhere, everything trembled. Collector implants shattered. Neural links combusted. Their ship spasmed mid-airlock, automated systems shorting into spastic chaos. The boarding parties collapsed where they stood, weapons warping armor convulsing. In orbit, Captain Zarn's ship reeled. Core matrices failed to stabilize. Tracking algorithms looped, glitching under data they could not parse. 1,000 years of evolution, and still no preparation for resonance this pure. The enemy withdrew, limping into deep space like a wounded beast that had brushed against something holy. Zarthan Station held. Barely, but it held. In the chamber, Celira collapsed into Kale's arms. Her skin dimmed, but her pulse steady. Their child pulsed stronger now, no longer just a spark, but a presence. The tide had turned, not with armies, not with fleets, but with a bond that rewrote the language of survival. Zarthan Station drifted in silence, its wounded systems humming with rebirth. The Collector's fleet was gone, crippled, its hunting tools ruined, its algorithms corrupted by harmonic energy it was never built to withstand. All that remained was a long echo through space, fading into the void. Within the command center, Kael Varel stood beside Celira, who now moved with slower grace, her luminous skin recharged but transformed. The harmonic pulse had altered her at a cellular level. Her connection to the station no longer required focus. It responded to her presence automatically. Lights adjusted to her rhythm. Doors opened before her steps. Systems pinged in unison with her breath. Their bond had shifted from fusion to governance. Together, they were no longer fugitives hiding in vent shafts. They were the core of a new structure, a hybrid system of human engineering and lunari energy. The child they carried would be born into this frequency, its earliest thoughts synchronized to a station that had become a living cradle. Commander Vale no longer barked orders. He observed. The efficiency charts rendered daily now reached levels previously deemed impossible. Nitheron consumption had stabilized. System downtime had plummeted. Atmospheric regulators maintained perfect equilibrium, and even long-defunct auto-repair units had begun moving again, activated by something outside of human command structures. Protocols had no place for this, so Vale rewrote them. Celira received full authorization as a harmonic systems consultant, operating under the engineering branch with Kael as liaison. Her housing was moved from secrecy into official quarters, connected private and facing the external starfield. An allowance of Nitheron was permanently assigned, and the child, though not yet born, was logged into the genetic registry marked only as hybrid class unknown. But no title could measure what they had become. In the quiet weeks after the surge, Kael often sat beside the emitter array, the same one that had once threatened to overload, and listened. The station's hum now carried tones that hadn't existed before, chords layered with nuance, echoes of two heartbeats woven into steel. Celira would join him there sometimes, her presence a silent weight at his side, their hands grazing without need for words. Between them pulsed the soft thrum of new life. Its rhythms were unpredictable yet stable, as if the child had inherited their improvisation. Outside, merchant fleets began to arrive again. Rumors of the pulse had traveled across sectors, a station that had fended off collectors without kinetic weapons. A Lunari not only alive but thriving within human territory. A human who fought beside her, not above her. The whispers spread something had shifted in the void. The Council of Expansion dispatched envoys, not soldiers, scholars, diplomats, observers of the unexplainable. They came expecting an anomaly. They found a beginning. Kael presented their data logs, readouts, energy charts, but none of it could capture what had truly changed. The real transformation couldn't be documented in numbers. It lived in glances, in gestures, in the way Celira's fingers would linger on metallic surfaces and coax broken conduits back to life without touch. In the evenings, when Zarthan's artificial dusk swept across the station, the pair would sit beneath the viewport, watching starfields shift like woven fabric. Sometimes Kael would recount old Earth folktales, his voice low-layered with memory. Celira listened with eyes half-lidded, her breath synced to the flicker of solar currents outside. Their child responded to stories more than systems. When Kael spoke, tiny pulses would ripple beneath Celira's skin, as if the unborn listener knew the shape of his father's voice before the world had even begun. In time, the station would become more than a waypoint. It would evolve into a sanctuary. A new frontier, not of weapons, but of resonance. A place where two species met not in conflict, but in convergence. And in the chamber where Nitheron once bled into silence, there now echoed the quiet harmony of three heartbeats braided into one rhythm that pulsed far beyond the hull, into the stars themselves. Thus ends the story of Kael Varel and Celira, a tale born not of conquest or command, but of connection. In a forgotten corner of space, amidst flickering lights and a fuel leak, no sensor could trace a mechanic, and an alien stranger rewrote the future. They did not set out to lead a revolution or alter the tide of interstellar history, but through empathy, courage, and the quiet power of resonance, they forged a bond that reshaped everything. Their child, pulsing with harmonies from two worlds, would one day become more than a symbol. It would become a bridge, between species, between technologies, between what was and what could be. Stories like these remind us that sometimes the smallest choices, a hand extended instead of a weapon raised, can open portals no machine ever could. And perhaps out there among the stars, others are still waiting for someone to reach beyond fear, beyond protocol, and listen. If this story stirred something in you, share it. Leave a comment. Tell us what moment struck your heart the most, and subscribe for more sci-fi journeys, where humanity's greatest trait isn't its strength, but its stubborn, hopeful ability to connect. This is HFY, and this was the story of resonance,